QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021 Purchase Order P.O. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars homepage. We currently have the Open Windows open. You can open the Open Windows by going to the View dropdown and selecting the Open Windows list. We're now going to be entering a purchase order. When we're thinking about the purchase order, we're going to be on the vendor side of things. You will not be dealing with a purchase order unless you have inventory and you're buying inventory. And even then, you might not be dealing with purchase orders unless you're in a situation where you have the request for the order. So in other words, if we buy and sell inventory, for example, you might buy and sell inventory, and if you buy for something like Amazon or something like that, if I buy for my personal self, if I bought something like on an Amazon or online store, then typically what will happen is I will pay for it when I purchase it, and then they will ship it to me. So I've already basically made a transaction at the point in time that I requested the inventory in order to purchase it, and therefore I would record the transaction at that point in time, recording basically a credit card transaction or an actual payment that's going to be coming out of my checking account or whatever other type of payment format that I will be using. It's a little bit different if you're in a situation where you're able to have a little bit more control on the purchasing side of things and be able to basically have a purchase order, a request for inventory. And so let's imagine the situation that we are going to be purchasing guitars. We're going to send out a purchase order. That purchase order doesn't have any payment related to it. It simply says, hey, I would like this many guitars for you to send to us. Once we get it here in our warehouse, we will count those guitars, and at that point in time, we will record the bill and then make the payment. So the difference there being that when we send out this form, this purchase order, there's not actually any payment taking place. It's just a request, as opposed to if we were to buy something and actually pay at the point in time of purchase, then we would simply be making a payment at that point in time, recording a credit card transaction or a transaction, a payment out of the checking account at the point in time of purchase. So we're going to, now the other thing that's kind of funny about the purchase order, notice that because of that situation, because of the situation that we're not actually recording any transaction, it's just a request, unlike pretty much every other form that we have here, like a bill, an invoice, the sales receipt, the received payment, these all are financial transactions. And when we use this form, it will record something to the financial statements, the balance sheet and the income statement. Unlike the purchase order, even though we want to track the purchase order, it is not actually a financial transaction. No effect then will be on the financial statements. No accounts will be going up or down with this particular form, as opposed to pretty much, again, like every other form. What we do want to do is track the purchase order so that we can then know that we sent out a request for this many guitars. We expect then to receive those guitars in a warehouse with a bill most likely attached. And once we do, we're going to say, okay, now we received it, and we can record the receipt here. When it closes, I didn't mean to click on it. We're going to record the receipt here as we receive the inventory and the bill at that point in time. So we want to link then the receiving of it to the purchase order. So let's take a look at it. We're going to say, let's open up a purchase order. We're going to say that we're buying guitars. Our major vendor is going to be Epiphone. So we're buying from Epiphone. So I can hit the drop down. There's Epiphone. Or I can type in Epiphone. And that's coming from our vendors that we set up when we first basically started the company here. That's who we're paying to, who we buy from. This is our major vendor. And so we're not going to put anything in the drop ship to. We got the template. We're going to use the standard template. This is the default template for the purchase order provided by Intuit or QuickBooks. You can customize the templates here. I'm going to make the date as of the 12th. I just hit the plus arrow on the keyboard, or the plus button on the keyboard, to bring it up one. I'm going to say the first number for the purchase orders is, let's just keep it at 1. It'll pre-number the purchase orders for us as we start to make the purchase orders. The vendor and the ship to addresses are coming from our data. So we entered our address into the system. It's being populated. That's going to be our financial data when we set up our major, not our financial data, that's our general data. When we set up the company, we entered our address, and we entered the vendor address when we set up the vendor. So then we're going to say that the item is going to be, we can select the drop down. Now this is going to be an inventory item. We're looking for the ELP. So we want the ELP, which is an Epiphone Les Paul. So you could type in ELP, it'll start to populate. And then you have the Epiphone Les Paul. So there's the Epiphone Les Paul has been populated. It pulled that. Where did it get that from? the items that we set up. And notice we're gonna buy, let's buy 50 of these, and they're gonna be at 400, so that's gonna give us 20,000. So we have 20,000 of the full amount over here. Now, note that where did it get this $400? It got that from the item. Let's just check that out real quick, because this is one of the more confusing components oftentimes. If I go to the Home tab, just to go out of that invoice, and then I'm going to go to the Lists dropdown, Item List, and we set up these items, and you can see here's the ELP, and the price is 500. Where's the cost? Well, if I double click on that item, you see the cost is 400. That's how much we buy them for. We're going to sell them for 500. So that's what they're in the system for. When we make an invoice, in other words, 500 will appear. When we buy it, 400 will appear on the purchase order that is part of the purchasing process. So closing this back out, we're gonna go back on over. So there we have it. And then we have the customer field. Now the customer field is going to be an optional type of field, because the vendor, the person that we're buying from, doesn't need to know whether or not we're buying this specifically for a customer or not. But it would be useful for us on our side to be able to link this purchase order if it was a request from a customer. In other words, we're going to imagine that we have a customer requesting these guitars from us. We're going to buy from Epiphone and pass it on to this customer, as opposed to us just buying 400 or the 50 guitars and just keeping them in our store. And that means that once we create the bill, QuickBooks will actually kind of remind us of that, follow along in the process, that now we have received the purchase order for this particular customer, and that will then help us out to populate the invoice that we will then create once we get the guitars. We're going to say, hey customer, we got the guitars now. We're going to invoice you and bill you. You can come pick up basically the guitars. So I'm going to say the customer is going to be Eric Music. We're going to say Eric Music. So it's a new customer. So I'm going to type in the customer and say tab. Now we're going to auto set it up. In practice, you would probably want to put as much detail as you would from a customer that's going to be a repeat customer, such as possibly Eric Music, so that you have your contact information. You can send the memo out to them and everything and whatnot. But I'm just going to do a quick add for the purposes of our practice problem. So a quick add is all you need in order to populate or add the vendor, and that'll add the vendor name. And so there's going to be our information. What is this going to do when we record it to the financial statements? Nothing. This guy's not going to do anything to it, which is kind of funny. But it will help us to track to when we get the actual inventory, so that we can match up our purchase order to what we have received, and then we will affect the financial statements by entering the bill at that point in time. So let's say save and close. And then if I'm not going to record the receive inventory, but just so we can see what we expect to happen in the future. If I hit this drop down, we have receive inventory with a bill, receive inventory without a bill. We expect to receive the inventory with a bill typically. They're going to give us the guitars that we haven't yet paid for and say, hey, here's the bill. And if I was to select then the Epiphone, our major vendor, notice this pops up and says open purchase order exists for this vendor. It's linking the purchase order to the vendor. So we should have that pop up. Do you want to receive against one or more of these orders? And typically we would say yes at that point, and then we're going to populate that. So we'll see that in a future presentation. But just note that that's the next step we expect to happen. So I'm going to say, I'm going to close this and I'm not going to record it. You have not recorded. I'm going to say, no, I don't want to record it. So now we're going to do this again. We're going to say, let's go into another purchase order. We're going to have another purchase order for another vendor. Now we're going to imagine now this is a new vendor. So we're going to be setting up a new vendor at this point. So if I select the drop down, the new vendor we want is Gibson, and there's no Gibson in the drop down. So I'm going to say, all right, we got to set up a new vendor and a new guitar. We're going to be looking for a new guitar that we're going to be purchasing from a new vendor. So the new vendor is going to be Gibson. So I'm going to say Gibson tab, and they're going to say, do you want to set up this vendor? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to quickly set it up. This is a major vendor that we purchase guitars from. So in practice, we would probably want to enter all the detailed contact information, but here I'm just going to enter the name of the company, vendor, nothing in the drop ship. We're going to use the standard format of the form. I'm going to keep it at 112, and the purchase order now populating automatically. You can see there's no address in the vendor because we didn't add one this time because we just did the quick add, and there's our address. Now the item, we don't have the item yet because this is a new a new vendor for us. We actually had a Gibson before, but we haven't entered into the QuickBooks system yet, this vendor, because we haven't entered it yet. So this is going to be a GSB. That was the beginning data from the inventory. That's why that guitar was there from Gibson, because that was purchased before we started the QuickBooks file. So Gibson did not find a GSB, so we're gonna have to set that up. So I'm gonna say, all right, let's say yes. And now notice we're now on our inventory item here. So we have our inventory item. This is entering the item, the inventory items, rather than going to the lists to do it. We're just doing it as we go, as we enter the purchase order. So I'm going to tab through this. We have the GSB, and I'm going to keep it. I'm just going to go to the description, and this is going to be a Gibson SG. Gibson SG. We're going to sell it for $598. The cost of goods sold is going to be correct. That's going to be the expense account that it goes to when we sell it. And then the preferred vendor, we could say, is Gibson. That would probably be good. Let's put the preferred vendor, it's Gibson. And then on the sales description, same description, sales price, we're going to sell it for $777.4. And tax, there will be tax related to it. That's going to be referring to sales tax when we make the sale. And we're going to record the account being an income account. And it's going to be the sales income account rather than the service income account that will be populated once we make an invoice related to the sale of this particular inventory item. So right now we're purchasing the inventory, or we're going to purchase it. We're requesting to purchase, and that's going to be the $598 is going to be used. The $777.4 is going to be used when we make the invoice or sales receipt on the sales side of things. So let's go ahead and say okay. So there we have it, and there it is. I'm going to say that we have 10 of those. So that's 10 times the 598 is the 5980 that we're requesting. And again, the customer field is optional because we might be buying this for just our store, or we might be buying it for a customer. Remember that the vendor doesn't care, about the customer, that whether we're buying it for someone else or not doesn't matter to the vendor. Our customer field is only there for us. It's there for us to see, to help us to track this information. Once we receive it, then telling us, hey, now we can link this to the invoice and help us to then actually purchase it from or sell it to, at that point, the customer. So this is going to be a new customer. I'm going to generic name, Music Stuff Store. Music Stuff Store. That's the name. Yep. Yes, it is. Okay, so I'm going to say tab on that. We're going to set it up. It's going to be, this is a customer again, so in practice, we would probably want the full setup here, but for purposes of the practice problem, quick add, we're going to quick add it, and there we have it. So I'm going to say save and close. And there we have it. Now, we're going to receive those. We expect to receive both of those in the future. So in the future, when we do that, we're going to enter a bill. Then we're going to pay the bill on the vendor side of things. And then on the customer side of things, when we get the guitars, we're then going to jump down here to the invoicing process and go to those customers that we bought the guitar specifically for and enter the invoice related to that customer now that we have the guitars that we're going to be selling to them, and we'll go through the customer side of things to actually sell those guitars. Also note that if I go to the lists drop down and go to the item lists, we set up that new item here, which was the GSB guitar. So there's the GSB guitar. If I double click on this item, we set it up, and we set it up as we went. We set it up as we populated, in other words, the purchase order. Closing that back out. That's going to be it for now. No effect on the financial statements. That's why we're not checking out the financial statements. No effect on them. There will be next time when we do something related to the PO, which is receive the guitars.